So the first thing that I want to do here is actually build the form. So that's sort of the most important part of all of this. And so that's what I want to start with. So we're going to start with this form method here. And so, there's a number of things that we know we need to do here, but when this form is submitted, one of the things that we need to do is we need to make sure that what we're submitting, the way we're going to submit this, we're going to use sort of the built-in. We're not going to create our own sort of post routine. We're going to use WordPress's built-in form handling. And so we need to make sure, though, what that essentially does is when you submit it to, you're going to submit it to a page, an admin page in WordPress called admin-post.php. So this is actually going to be submitted to another URL, and then we need to be able to redirect back to the whatever page this form was submitted from, so that we can show our status message. So to the user, it looks like the page just submits to itself, but it actually goes to a WordPress admin page that is built for handling submission of form data, and then it'll redirect back to the page that it came from. But we need to tell admin-post which page it came from. So we're going to have a way that we do that, but in order to do that, one of the first things that we need to do is we need to globalize the post that we're on. So we have the post ID, and we can send that through. We also need to handle our short code. If you're not familiar with short codes can have parameters. So you can do things like, let's just say honeypot equals true. You can add parameters like this, and you can have as many as you want in a short code, and that is how someone can set. You can insert a short code and have options. So you could have, different forms or different options for your form or so forth. Now, for this, we're keeping it pretty basic. I'm going to show you. I'm going to have some optional attributes. We're not actually going to use them in the form when we do this, but just to show you how you actually handle short codes inside of WordPress. So WordPress has this function called short code attribute. So I'm gonna write this, and we're gonna do @ equals, and we're gonna do short code @. This is a built-in WordPress function, and we will do this. And inside this, then we're gonna create an array. And in the array, we're going to essentially set some standard options here. So let's go ahead and push this back here, and we're going to do @, and then we're going to say JMO form, and we can actually back this up too. All right, so if you look at this, we're calling the shortcode @'s function, and we're passing in an array for the first parameter. We're passing in our @s from what was submitted to this shortcode handler, and then we're giving this a name. This essentially allows other plugins to filter these attributes. So this makes this extensible. So what is this @s? Well, this is, if we come back over here and if we set, add honeypot equals true, when this page loads, WordPress actually takes this, and it takes all of these parameters and puts them into an array, and we'll talk about how all that data ultimately gets to this method here in a second. But it creates these attributes, it turns them into a PHP array and sends them to this method in this @s. So this @s variable is actually an array, and it's got all of these in an associative fashion. So add honeypot is the first element. It's set to true. Whatever other parameters you would have in this shortcode will be in this array. So what shortcode @ allows us to do is it allows us to set defaults, because we may want to allow add honeypot and let them set that option, but we also want to have a default. And so that's what this does. So what we do is is this simply right here, we set our defaults. So that's what this array is. add honeypot, and we are going to set it to false by default. Okay, so what shortcode ats is going to do is it's going to look at this array that was submitted from what came in shortcode, and it's going to look at this array of defaults, and if this option, this element exists in this array, it's going to overwrite this default with what was submitted from the shortcode. However, if it doesn't exist in this array that was submitted from the shortcode, it's going to use this default. So this array right here is essentially your defaults for your shortcodes. That's really the sort of the big thing when it comes to handling shortcodes is dealing with the defaults versus what is submitted from or what is added to the parameters in this shortcode here. So this is essentially shortcode handling 101 right here, is this section right here. So that's how you do it. And what you end up with is this is all set to equal. You end up with this ats array, which stands for attributes. You end up with this ats array that has all of your options. It's done all of the filtering through the defaults and what's set in the shortcode and etc. And you now have an array of attributes for this particular shortcode here. So you can now trust what you have from this. Okay. Now again, we're not going to actually use this I mean we are, but we're not going to submit that parameter in our shortcode here. But I wanted to show you this because shortcodes is sort of a big thing that you're going to deal with inside of WordPress. All right, so now the next thing that we need to do is we need to start building our form. Remember, this is the page where we're going to fill out our form. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to instantiate the form class. So this is our class that we included right up here. So if you remember from the GitHub post, you just do something simple like form equals new, and it's PHP form builder. And we're not going to set any. You can set some of the attributes when you call this, but we're just going to use the set attribute option to do this. So this gets us going with our form builder. Next thing we need to do is set some attributes. So we're going to do set our form options, and we're going to set 2 here. So the first one is our action block. Remember, I said we're going to send this to admin-post.php. So we're going to have WordPress use its built-in form handling here. So we need to set the action attribute here. So we're going to do set at, and again, this I just want to make sure all this set at right here, this isn't WordPress. This is coming from our form builder right here. This is how this was built. So just want to make sure that that's clear, the difference between built-in WordPress functions and what's coming from our PHP form builder class. So set at, and we are going to set the action attribute, and we are going to set that. We need to set that to admin-post.php. So WordPress has a built-in function that you can use to easily get admin pages. So it's called admin_URL. Now, if you just use that by default, that's going to send you essentially to the dashboard page in WordPress, which isn't what we want. So what you can do with this function is you can pass in the slug or the page, the ending URL, the path of the admin page that you want. So in this case, we want admin-post.php. And so what this is going to do is this is going to give us what we need essentially to create the WordPress URL. So this is going to do the hard work of figuring out, okay, what's the URL, the domain that it's installed in? Where's WordPress, and what's the WordPress path? Maybe it's in a subfolder, it's 3 subfolders deep or whatever. We don't have to worry about any of that. We just say use admin URL, WordPress knows, and then we say we want this admin page and all the different menu items in WordPress. So if we come over here, posts has edit.php. This is upload.php. This is edit.php with the post type set to page. This is edit comments. So all of these different admin pages have a different ending sort of area here. This happens to be the one that that accepts form data that we can use. Now, one other thing that we want to do here is we're gonna, again, WordPress has this escape URL built-in function, and this just makes sure that this is essentially safe when we put it into our form here. So we're going to use escape URL around this admin URL here. So it's just again, making sure it's safe for use in our code here. All right, so that sets the action block for our form. Now the next thing that we need to set is, we did this honeypot thing here. We need to make sure that we set that for our form. And again, the add honeypot option comes from this. So if you see right here, down here, add honeypot is one of the options that you can use from this PHP class. So we just want to make sure, doing this right here gets everything set up and gets our defaults and all that sort of set up, but we still need to tie it into our actual form builder here. So we're going to do form and set at, and it was the add honeypot option, and then we're going to set that to @add honeypot. That what came from up here, whether it's the default or what was passed through the shortcode. So that's how you tie something from the shortcode through your method here into the actual form, so that if we set this to true, if we came and did add honeypot equals true, that would override this add honeypot equals false, and now we'd have an honeypot added to here. Okay, so that's how you accept options in your shortcodes. I know I'm sort of hammering that, but it's a really big thing when you're working with WordPress plugins. A lot of plugins that you see out there use shortcodes. We haven't actually tied this through yet, and I'll show you how to do that once we get done building the form. But again, that's how you sort of tie things together. All right, next we're going to add our form inputs. So add our form inputs, and you remember from over here we use this add input method here, and we have a bunch of different options. So argument 1 is a human readable label that is parsed and turned the name and ID if these options aren't explicitly set. Argument 2 is an array of settings. So this is essentially where we can say if we want a text field, or if we want a select box. And if we want a select box, then we're going to add in our options will be a part of what we can add there. And then argument 3 is a string valid for HTML attribute, uses the name and ID. Okay, so it has 3 different options. These are all of the different options you can set for argument number 2, okay, for this array right here. So type, name, ID, etc. So again, it's just a form builder. It's going to build the inputs for us. So we're going to do, as far as what you can see on the front end, we're going to do name, email, website, and message, as you saw from this form right here. We also need some hidden fields that we're going to do. So we need an action block, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. We also need a nonce so that we can verify our form. And as I mentioned earlier, we need a redirect. So that redirect is what's going to allow it, when it gets submitted to admin post, we're going to send the URL that submission came from to admin post, so that if in our form handler, which we'll talk about down here, which is going to be this method, we can create a redirect back to the original post. Okay, so let's actually go ahead and do the inputs first. Okay, so we'll do the public facing one. So we'll start with name. We'll do form add input, and we're going to call this name. This is the human readable label that's going to show right here. Okay, so this right here is what this first option is. Then remember the second argument is an array of options. So we'll do array, and we'll come down here. And the third option is then sort of the label is essentially the name of the form input. So when you create a form and you have to give it a name so that when you submit it to your post data, the element in the array that stores this data has this particular name. So that's what this is. So this is the human readable name. This is the name in the actual input. If we just inspect this real quick. So you see name equals name. That's what this is here. Okay. So this is the name, and then this array in here is going to be the settings, the attributes for this particular input. So we're going to do type equals text, and we are going to do a placeholder, and we will set that to enter your name. And then we're going to set whether this is required or not. So required and true. And I got a mistake here. All right, so that's how we add an input. We whatever the label is the first option. The second option is array of essentially the input attributes. So the type, the placeholder, the required, basically anything you want. You can see all of them right here. Type, name, ID, label, value, placeholder, class. If it's a select box or a radio or a checkbox, you have this options, which is an array where you set the actual options. Min, max, step. I mean, there's all sorts of different options here. We're not using all of them. You don't have to use all of them. But essentially, this is going to add in all of your inputs. Now, I'm going to sort of fast forward here a little bit just for time's sake, because a lot of these public-facing ones are actually really similar. So we have name, we have email, we set type to email, placeholders, enter your email address, required equals true, and this is set to email. So you can see these are all really pretty similar, except for we just changed email and we use the type of email here in this. Website, the type is set to URL. Placeholders, enter your website URL. We're not requiring this. And then again, the name is set to website. And then our message, this is a text area. Our placeholder is sent to enter your message. This is required. And again, our name is called a message. So again, I just didn't want to bog you down with me typing all those out. So I just pasted those in there. But you can see they follow that same pattern there. So I think pretty straightforward there. Now we have, again, 3 hidden inputs that we need to talk about. So the first one is what we're going to call the action. So we're going to do form and we're going to do add input, and we're going to call this action, and it's hidden. So we don't need to, the label doesn't really matter too much. But again, we're going to do array, and we're going to do this. And we'll give this, again, the name of action. And then in our array here, our type is going to be set to hidden. So this is if you're not familiar with hidden form or hidden inputs, essentially this is something that you can have submitted with your form, but it doesn't show up. It's not an editable input on here. It just is submitted sort of in the background. If we look over here, you can see we have input, the name is set to action, type equals hidden, the value equals JMO contact form. You don't see that anywhere on here. So this is a hidden field. And we are going to, as you saw, set the next option here, which is we're going to set the value to JMO contact form. And the reason why that we need this is, again, goes back to what we were talking about with how this form is submitted. So again, this form is going to be submitted to admin post, and so that admin post takes form submissions from all sorts of different forms throughout WordPress. So we need a way to know when we go to our form handler down here, we needed a way to be able to pull out our particular form submissions that we want to handle, so we can handle those in the way that we want to work with them. So the way that we're doing that is we're submitting this field, this hidden field called JMO contact form. And then when we get into our form handler, we can use that to pull out and make sure that we're handling our own form. So that's an important part of this whole deal. All right, so that's the first hidden input that we need. The next one then is we need a nonce. So a nonce stands for number used once. It's a security thing, and essentially what we're going to do is in our form handler, we're going to verify this nonce, and what that tells us is it makes sure that the data that we're processing in our form handler was submitted from this form, not from a hacker building a form on their own site and then sending it to admin.post and trying to recreate our form here and then be able to hack our site, etc. So we're just verifying that the data that we're handling was set from this form, and we're only going to handle that data. If it's it's not that data, then we're just going to ignore it. So form add input, and we're going to give this a name of WP nonce. And we will do array, and again we'll do WP nonce right here. And then for our options, as you probably guessed, we'll do type equals hidden. And then the value for this is a little tricky because we need to create an actual nonce that can be verified. Fortunately, WordPress has a built-in way of doing that. So we're going to do value, and we're going to use the built-in WordPress function WP create nonce. And when you use this function, you need to add in essentially a unique identifier for this particular form and action. So it's going to be submit contact form. What this value is sort of up to you. You kind of want to try to make it somewhat unique, but what WordPress recommends is that it be something that speaks to what the action being performed is. So in this case, they're submitting a contact form. So we're going to need this later when we get into our form handler to again pull out of our nonce and verify our nonce. So we just need to pass this for right now, but this function does everything that we need to do in order to create the nonce for us. All right, so the last hidden input that we need to do here is the one we talked about earlier, which is our redirect ID. So we're going to do redirect ID, again our array, and we'll do again redirect ID. And in our array options, as you might have guessed, hidden field. And then the value is going to be, remember we globalized post earlier, because this is a short code that's inserted into a page, and so post, there's going to be this post variable on this page, and so we can just globalize post, and now we have access to all of the information about this particular page. Of course, the only thing that we need is we just need the post ID. So we're going to do post ID like this. So that's going to, when we submit the form, it's going to submit a hidden field named redirect ID with the value, with the ID of the post that the form was submitted from. So that's what's going to allow us to be able to do our redirect. Okay. So that is our form. Now we need to just get into outputting the form. So there's a couple things that we need to do, because with shortcodes you can't just echo directly in the method here. What WordPress is expecting from this method is for the HTML that's to be displayed to be returned, and then WordPress has, in its processing of the shortcodes, will do the echoing for you. So if you echo here, let's say we put some content up here that said, fill out the form. If you echo in this method, if you output directly into this method, and we put our shortcode here, what would happen is your output would actually happen above this fill out the form. So it wouldn't be happening where you put the shortcode. So it's important that you make sure you always return out of a shortcode here. So with the way our form builder works though, when we run, if we come down here, when we run build form, this is you see it says outputs the form as HTML. So it's going to output. We don't really, I didn't dig into this too much. You may be a way for you to get around that, but right off the, just sort of looking at it at a glance, you don't have a way to get around that. So what we do is we're going to use output buffering. And so I'll just write this here so you know, shortcodes should not output data directly, or HTML directly, whatever. So what we're going to do is we're going to start an output buffer. So what an output buffer does is we're going to run build form, and it's going to output data, but what PHP is going to do is it creates a buffer, and it's going to actually catch all of that output, and instead of outputting it, it's going to put it into a buffer. And so it essentially keeps that data from being output directly and helps us get around the fact that this class happens to output directly. So we start that buffer. We're going to have a status message, so we'll go ahead and set up for that here real quick, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But we're going to have a status message when we do a redirect from our form handler, and we're going to do filter input, and we'll do input get. So it's going to be a get parameter. It's going to be URL parameter, the status message, and it's going to be called status, and we will use the filter. It's just going to be an integer, so it's going to be a 1 or a 0, or actually it's going to be a 1 or it won't even exist. Now the nice thing about filter input, which is a built-in PHP function, is that if this URL parameter doesn't exist, it's not going to throw an error. It actually runs is set within its own workings. So you can just run this, and if this exists, then it'll set whatever the value of this URL parameter is to this variable, and if it doesn't, it'll just be false. So it's pretty handy. So we need to do this before we build the form, because if you remember, our status message is on top of the form. So that's why we're doing the status message right here. So we're just going to check and see if the status, the URL parameter set, status is equal to 1, and if it is, then we are going to print out a status message. And so we'll do div class equals message and success if it's set to 1, and we'll do p, and we're going to actually we'll get this here, and I'll show you what we're doing here. We're using printf because, all right, so that's our format for what our message is going to be. But we are going to, with WordPress, when you output data, you always sort of add the option for localization. And that's what this function does. So you have two functions that you'll deal with heavily when it comes to localization. You'll have double underscore and you'll have underscore E. The difference is that underscore E will echo and double underscore will just return. Okay, so since we're using printf here, then we're going to just return out of this function. And all we're going to do in here is we're going to put your message was submitted successfully. And then we are going, if we go back up to the top, you'll remember we have our text domain, right? So we're going to take our text domain and we're going to use that down here. And we are going to pass that in as the second parameter to this double underscore method. So you might be asking, okay, why are we doing all of this? What this double underscore method does is it essentially, if there's let's say someone speaks Spanish and they create a language file, and remember we have that languages folder that we talked about before. They put a Spanish language file into that folder, and they select in WordPress that they're using in WordPress. You can select which language you want to use, and so they select Spanish. And the language file that they put into WordPress, into that languages folder, they will have translated this message right here. And so what WordPress will do is it will substitute the Spanish version for this message right here. So this essentially allows this to be translated. That's the whole point of this. And that's why we have the text domain that we set up in our plugin header, and then we reference that in our localization files so that WordPress knows that this message came from this plugin. And there's a whole way of doing that, and it's sort of a rabbit hole, which is why I'm not getting into it, because I want to try to keep this introductory and light. But when you're building your plugin, you always want to make sure and set up for that. So what printf is going to do, so the double underscore sets us up for localization. What printf does is it takes this second parameter, and when it outputs, it drops it in where we have this %s, where we have this placeholder. So we can't run this double underscore directly in this this format here. We could use concatenation or concatenation or whatever, however you say that word. We could do that, but I just like using printf. I think it's a little bit cleaner. And so I use printf to do that. All right, so that's our status message. And again, if we get a positive status message back, then that's only when this is going to display, and this message right here can now be translated into different languages if need be. So that's the whole point of everything that we just did there. So the next thing is we're going to build the form. And so if you remember, form, build, form, it's pretty much that simple. And so that's going to take all of this. Now it's going to take these attributes. It's going to take all of these inputs, and it's going to actually build the form and give us our actual form output over here. And then remember, we have output buffering on. So we're just going to, at that point, we're going to return and clean buffer contents. And so return ob get clean. Okay, so what ob get clean does, this is a built-in PHP function. So ob starts the buffer. So all of this output, the printing and the build form, all of that's not actually going to be output yet. It's going to be put into a buffer. And then when we run return ob get clean, get, it means it's going to get all of whatever's stored in that buffer. It's going to get that. And you could set this to, say, a variable like output equals, and it would set this output equal to whatever is stored in that buffer, the string essentially. So that's what the get part is. The clean part is then it's going to clean out the buffer. So essentially get clean is going to get all of our output, and we're going to have it now available, and then it's going to clean everything out of the buffer, which is important. So we can just return that. Remember, we have to return out of a shortcode. So essentially what this line here is doing is it's taking everything that we built here in this output that we didn't allow to output, we buffered. It's now returning that to WordPress and saying, here's the data from this method. So again, it's sort of specific to this because this outputs the way that it does, and we don't have a way to just grab the form and store it as a variable. We have to output it. That's why we use the output buffering here. And I actually, a lot of times when I do plugins, I will use output buffering like this, and I will close off, for example, close off PHP like this, and I might do something in just straight HTML, and then open PHP back up. And the output buffer is going to grab all of this. This is now considered output because we closed our PHP tags, and back here we're reopening. Anything in here is going to be actual direct output. And the reason you do that is because it makes it easier to write your HTML like this. You know, it actually shows up looking like standard HTML, whereas if you did it inside of PHP tags, it gets a little convoluted and hard to work with. So I actually still use the output buffering even if I'm not tied to a form like this. All right, so that is our form. That's probably, it's close to our biggest method. So we sort of tackled the largest frog right off the top. The last thing that we need to do with this form is we need